Hello learners, welcome to today's session. Today we are going to continue with the discussion on alienation and migration. In the last session, we discussed the concept of alienation and migration, and also we talked about the laws relating to land rights and land transfer. In this session, we will continue with further discussion. So when we talk about the legal framework, the different acts which are there are CNT Act of 1908, then SPTA Act of 1949, Land Acquisition Act of 1894, Coal Bearing Area Act, and SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989 are some of the legislation which govern land rights, regulate acquisition for public purpose, and protect the tribals from alienation of their resources, giving them executive protection. These legislation, to a limited extent, guarantee the customary rights of the community, define various category of the riayats, that is cultivations or tenants, then recognize special category of tenures, the rights of the riayats against rent or enhancement of rents, protection against transfer of riayati land, regulate the condition of transfer, and make a provision for the restoration of illegally alienated land. The SPT Act in many respects is similar to the CNT Act, but goes a step forward in recognizing the customary rights, then community life, individual right of the tenants, the community rights of settlement of land, then the protection of the rights of paharias, the provision for the restoration of illegally alienated land, the provisions regarding the acquisition of land, and the provision regarding the judicial procedure. Besides the other provisions, LA, that is Land Alienation Act, defines the purpose for which the land could be acquired. The Prevention of SC/ST Atrocities Act also has a provision for action against encroachment of land. The SPT Act is more rigorous than CNT Act as it prohibits alienation of all lands, including that of non-tribes, except for few category, that is extent of alienation of land, while CNT Act permits transfer of non-tribal land and alienation of tribal land for specific purposes. There is considerable controversy regarding the extent of alienation of tribal land, and there is hardly any reliable record of the extent of alienation of various kinds. As it has continued over the years, the estimates also vary. The provisions of the Panchayati Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act 1996 deserve special mention in this context. The Act specifically empowers the Gram Sabha and the Panchayat to prevent alienation of land in the scheduled areas and to an appropriate action to restore any unlawfully alienated land of scheduled tribes. Further, the Act also provides that the Gram Sabha or the Panchayats shall be consulted before making the acquisition of the land in the scheduled areas for various public purposes. A host of other powers of control over the local natural resources are vested with the Gram Sabha. Now let us discuss migration of tribals. All factors leading to land alienation compel the tribal population in many areas of India to migrate into remoter areas, especially forest reserve areas, leaving behind their normal habitats or in urban cities in search of a better employment. Thus, the tribal populace who lost their land and livelihood due to faulty and sometimes deliberate government policies now face the grind of government action. Protection of the forest cover is undoubtedly important. Today, however, it has become customary to put the onus squarely on the tribal for the depletion of the forest cover. No one cares to inquire critically as to what have actually caused the progressive shrinkage of forestry in all the tribal habitat area. We seem to be unmindful of the devastating role played by the external migrants, contractors, forest officials, even political leaders, and big industrial houses in destroying forests under the burden of government propaganda. The government has adopted unprecedented stern measures to evict the encroachers from the occupied forest land. We do not have enough details on the government motives behind these encroachments, but the question remains as to why a mass of tribal peasants should abandon their original habitat to settle in a forest reserve or other areas, thereby also risking eviction and other troubles. Moreover, the government also exercised an indifference attitude insofar as land grabbing by other agencies is concerned. Let us look into some of the living examples determining migration among the tribals and the consequences of migration. Before independence, the out migration of tribals to the urban and industrial cities was very meager. This was due to the physical environment constraints, the limited needs of the tribals also did not motivate them to come to cities. After independence, the picture has changed considerably. The change has been due to the implementation of 5-year plans, which has a bias towards the tribal development. The directive principles of the state policy have made special programs for the social, political, and economic development of the tribals with the objective of integrating them at the various levels of rural and urban communities. Secondly, the safeguards provided by the Constitution have made available to them great opportunities of education, entrepreneurship, and jobs in government service and organized sector. Reservations in service have opened up new avenues for the tribals. The process of social mobility has given a high status to the tribal migrants. As a matter of fact, the implementation of more than 100 development schemes for the tribals by different government departments has created a favorable ground for the immobile tribal population to undertake out migration to big cities and towns. However, there are a large number of tribals who did not get any benefit from these development schemes, and even such tribals had to migrate to other urban towns and big cities in search of livelihood, as they were left with no resources to stay in their hinterland, and there was no other alternative left than to migrate to urban areas. Let us now examine the problems of the Chota Nagpur tribal in the tea plantations of East India. These people were forced to migrate out of their homeland due to land alienation, economic exploitation by traders and moneylenders, and political oppression by the British government. The plantations were an exploitative organization which extracted all it could from its workers and from the region. The profits of this industry did not contribute towards the development of the region because they were siphoned off abroad. The workers were paid low wages and were in a semi-bonded condition. They had no legal protection or security in their work, and they were not allowed to leave the plantations. The area was unhealthy, resulting in high mortality and morbidity rates. Hence, the tribal workers, in fact, shifted from one form of exploitation to another. As return, migration was negligible over the generations. These tribal people lost all contact with their places of origin. They have now accepted their present residence as their homeland, though they form a group distinct from the local population. They are not antagonistic to them. They have assimilated with the dominant culture of the region but have at the same time retained their identity. However, these people have not been given the proper facilities for development, and there is very little upward mobility among them. They have largely remained as plantation workers or as low paid agricultural workers or even marginal farmers. They have not been given the status of scheduled tribes in Assam, though in Bihar, West Bengal, and Tripura, the same ethnic groups are scheduled tribes. These people are therefore denied institutional facilities for their social development. Another example is the tribal of Tripura. Tripura is a unique case where the local population became a minority within a short span of time. Till 1941, the indigenous tribal comprised 60% of the population, but in 1971 they decreased to 28%. Here too, immigration of Bengalis began over 100 years ago. The rulers of this princely state were keen to spread Bengali culture and they imported religious and administrative personnel from Bengal. In order to increase revenue, they encouraged Bengali peasants to cultivate wastelands. Migration went on in triplets during this period, and however, after partition, the flow of refugees increased tremendously, resulting in the present situation. The tribals did not protest initially because they were under the influence of the communists. They believed that their impoverishment was due to historical socio-economic conditions and the refugees could not be blamed. The immigrants, however, managed to gradually corner most of the lands owned by the tribals. And this happened even after the government passed laws preventing transfer of tribal land to non-tribal. It was only after 1967 when the Tripura Upjati Juba Samiti, a political party representing tribal interests, was formed that the tribals launched movements to remove non-tribals from their lands. The rapid deterioration of the economic conditions induced them to take this stand. At present, the state government has taken up some measures for the economic and social upliftment, such as formation of the autonomous district councils and introduction of their language as a medium of instruction. This has slowed down the intensity of the movement. Now let us see migration among tribal women and girls. The consequences of migration due to land alienation, faulty policy, and casual approach of the government towards land rights of the tribals, etc., has led to loss of identity and culture, besides snatching away their source of livelihood among the tribal communities. Along with men, tribal women and girls also migrate to urban towns and cities in different situations. For them, the society and cultural system in the cities is totally new and different, and adjustment is difficult in the initial stage. These tribal women and girls are facing a number of problems in the big cities in India where they have taken shelter. Their housing conditions are miserable, economically they are still poor, only few of them are in regular employment, and they are financially and sexually exploited in these big cities. Considering their vulnerabilities, it is important for us, social work professionals, to fight for their rights and justice. Understanding their socio-cultural constraints and their adjustment in a new environment, totally different from their hinterland, is a challenge for social work practice. A large number of women and girls from tribal areas migrate to cities and towns all over India. And most of these women and girls are illiterate and unskilled. They work in inhuman conditions in cities as the living standards is extremely poor. Then a great number of these migrants are being exploited by middlemen, contractors, construction companies, and employers. Many of these women and girls work as housemaids where their working hours extend up to 18 hours per day. And a large number of tribal women and girls become victims of sexual and financial exploitation. Their children rarely get an opportunity to go to school and learn a productive skill. And gradually, many women and girls lose contact with their kith and kin back home and become alienated from their culture as well as roots. In tribal areas, land is a symbol of the organization of community. When a transfer takes place beyond the threshold point, the community looks upon the process as alienation. It is thus obvious that transfer of land is not merely a question of exploitation of innocent tribals by cunning people, and there are more complex factors involved, which has been pointed out by Chaudhary in 1990. And one of the important problems which are arising in some areas after enthusiastic response to the program of education is the psychological resistance among the tribals. For some time, the educated youth was able to get absorbed in the new opportunities in the surrounding region, but in those areas where the level of education has increased, this is now becoming increasingly difficult. They find themselves blocked by the more advanced groups, which are more articulate and educationally better off. They psychologically detach themselves from their local surrounding, but when they fail to get foothold in the modern sector, they get disappointed and develop frustration. The gulf between the life in the tribal home and the life in a residential hostel, particularly in urban areas, is an important contributing factor for non-adjustment. Another important fact is that the tribal has no social linkages with the urban areas. These socio-psychological problems can be considered inevitable concomitant of the process of change. Hence, these will need to be accepted as a possible socio-psychological impediment which would arise in the process of change and which should be taken care of as part of educational program itself. When land alienation takes place, migration of tribals is inevitable. Let's now discuss the dynamics of tribal prioritization. There are various forces at work in the process of prioritization of the tribal. The two agents involved are the government and the non-government and money lenders and the landlords. As far as the government is concerned, both the colonial British India government and the independent Indian government may be held responsible to a large extent for the current state of affairs as discussed in the previous discussions. The government functions through the establishment of administration and the infrastructure such as the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the law and order machinery and the other implementing agencies. It also needs other supporting structures for its functioning, which it creates through the formulation and promulgation of policies and resolution in the form of acts and other legislations. The non-government agents who actively contribute to this process of proletarization are the money lenders and the landlords. These agents find support in the prevailing conditions of widespread illiteracy, rampant ignorance, and the dire socio-economic conditions of the weaker sections, which in turn are preserved as a consequence of government policies and apathy towards the weaker sections. Those immediately responsible and directly contributing to this process of marginalization and widening gap between haves and have-not, besides the moneylenders and landlords, are the local bureaucrats and the politicians. These constitute the crucial link between the government and the non-governmental agents, between the people and the government, and between the people and the moneylenders and the landlords by providing them the necessary support. A gradual but steady penetration of capitalist forces is also evident in this process, resulting ultimately in the concentration of power and of the means of production in the hands of the minority dominant classes through the disposition of the weaker sections, primarily of their lands and their assets. It is a disposition not merely at an individual level, but rather a disposition of the means of production of an entire class of people and its transfer and concentration in the hands of the dominant few. The process of proletarization thus seems to be the inevitable outcome of such an exploitative structure, of which dispossessing of tribal and their lands is but a minuscule component. And yet, it is perhaps the single most significant feature of this phenomenon, at least as far as the tribal are concerned. Let us now discuss tribal identity in transition. Decades ago, when the forests were plentiful and the environment was conducive to hunter-gatherer economy of the tribal, one could still hope to find a pure tribal in the true sense of the word. With the changing economic situation and the penetration of the capitalist market forces, and a transformation is in the progress, there is no tribal group that may be defined as pure, quote unquote, except few small isolated tribal population. This new concept gives rise to a totally new dynamics, and stereotyping the tribal as forest dwellers becomes unfair or inappropriate. This transition leads to tribal economy and lifestyle transformed from a forest-based one to a land-based one. However, land and forest can never be totally disaggregated. Together with the changing dynamics, the relationship is becoming clearer as the shift on dependence for survival is tending more and more towards land and settled cultivation from forest and shifting cultivation. This brought about change in the form of land ownership and its distribution, which further paved the way for penetration of capitalist forces. In this changing context, the concept of land as a productive asset is gaining increasingly greater significance for the tribals and is steadily replacing the forest as an alternative for survival. Now let us sum up. Tribals are at the bottom of social and political ladder in India. Development projects have not only bypassed them but have often harmed them by taking away their lands and other resources on which their livelihood was based. Unless the processes which result in their prioritization are identified and corrective action taken to prevent it, chances are that new program will continue to ignore their interests as in the past. Articulation of such processes will not only lead to appropriate solutions, but it also helps in sensitizing field officers who in the past often held a negative stereotype about tribals. From the viewpoint of policy, it is important to understand that tribal communities are vulnerable not only because they are poor, assetless, and illiterate compared to the general population. Often their distinct vulnerability arises from their inability to negotiate and cope with consequences of their forced integration with the mainstream economy, society, cultural and political system from which they were historically protected as a result of their relative isolation. Post independence, the requirements of land development brought with them the spectra of dams, mines, industries, and roads on the tribal lands. With these came the concomitant processes of displacement, both literal and metaphorical, as tribal institutions and practices were forced into uneasy existence, which or gave away to the market or formal state institutions, most significantly in the legal sphere. Tribal groups found themselves at a profound disadvantage with respect to the influx of better equipped outsiders into tribal areas, and the repercussions for the already fragile socio-economic livelihood base of the tribals were devastating, ranging from loss of livelihoods, land alienation on a vast scale, to hereditary bondage. As tribal people in India perilously, sometimes hopelessly, grapple with these tragic consequences, the small clutch of bureaucratic programs have done little to assist the precipitous pauperization, exploitation, and disintegration of tribal communities. Tribal people respond occasionally with anger and assertion, but often also in anomie and despair. However, that too is branded as a typical law and order problem, ignoring its socio-economic dimension. Briefly speaking, the following persistent problems have by and large remained unattended and need immediate redressal, that is, relation with forests and government monopoly over NTFPs, non timber forest produce, then land alienation and indebtedness, involuntary displacement due to development projects and lack of proper rehabilitation, then ineffective implementation of panchayats, extension to the Scheduled Areas Act of 1996, that is PESA for scheduled areas, shifting cultivation, weak governance and poor program delivery, especially in health and education, and insensitive reaction to upsurge of tribal anger against the exploitative system. With this, we come to the end of this session. Hope you understood the concept of alienation and migration, as well as the different causative factors, the laws, and also the dynamics of tribal migration. Keep watching the videos. Till then, take care and bye.